Hello, my name is Frederik Steinmetz for BlenderDiplom.com, and in this chapter of the modifier series, I'd like to demonstrate the updated version of the Bevel Modifier. Since Blender 2.74, the Bevel Modifier has increased in versatility, which means it's now much more sophisticated. So let's just take the default cube and add the Bevel Modifier. Right now you don't see much of a difference between the old version and the new version, but there are a lot more buttons over here. First of all, what does it do? The Bevel Modifier makes edges look more realistic, I'd say. If I turn this off, you can see those edges are exactly 90 degrees, and unless you're using high precision machinery to carve your objects, you're probably never going to get an edge as perfect as this. So what you can do is use the Bevel Modifier to just slightly, bevel that edge, and it looks a lot more realistic. Also, you can turn the shading to smooth afterwards, which looks very strange if I don't use the Bevel Modifier, because it will try to smooth 90-degree angles, and that's just not correct. But usually objects with the shading set to smooth look a lot more realistic. But to see what the bevel does more clearly, I'm going to disable the smooth option and keep the flat shading. Alright, so one general thing, like most modifiers, this is relative to the scale of the object. So if I were to increase the scale, you can see that the width actually increases with the scale. If I decrease the scale and zoom in, the cube will look exactly the same, but if I press Ctrl A now and apply the scale, you can see it'll get bigger, which is a lot more important for non-uniform scale. For example, if I scale along the x-axis, this region looks a bit weird because it gets multiplied with the x value. So the newly created faces by the modifier are more stretched in x direction. And you can easily fix that by pressing Ctrl A and applying the scale. And now it's normal again. Okay, great. Let's have a look at the first option. You can plainly see that you get a triangle here, which is something that most people, including me, don't really prefer, which is one of the reasons why I didn't really like the original Bevel Modifier. One more important one was it was destroying the UVs, but we're getting to that point later. But if you just increase the segments to 2, you can see there are no more triangles. It's now all quads. So this is just one hint. If you dislike triangles, don't set the segments to an odd number. The options that were also in the original modifiers are the only vertices, and if I do this, it gets a lot more apparent. If I choose a bigger width, I'll put the segments to 0, and now you can see it's beveling only the corners of the object, meaning these pointy ones where there is a single vertex, and this will have an interesting effect. I guess you can most likely use it for crystals or gems. I actually used it for bone shapes, and because then you get a really interesting looking shape that's not just a normal cube. But that's it about the only vertices. I'm going to decrease the width again, and let's have a look at the profile. In order for the profile to work, you need more than one segment, so I'm going to increase this to 4. Now, right now the profile means we're getting a nice rounded edge at the edge of our objects, obviously, but if I decrease the profile, you can see the opposite happens. And this is a really nice effect, which makes it very easy to stick faces like that out. If I do the opposite, increase the profile all the way up to 1, the bevel becomes invisible, so don't do that. But if I increase the profile between 0.5 and 1, you can see the edge gets more sharp. So 0.5 would be normal, and this is a rounded edge, minus 0.35, meaning resulting in 0.15, would be the opposite of the bevel, inverse, and this makes it all the more sharp, I'd say. Alright, another very cool feature that got added into the bevel is the material offset. The bevel modifier is one of the generate modifiers, which means it generates faces, and you can influence those newly generated faces by, for example, giving them a new material. I'm going to use the settings here. I'll change the viewport color to blue. I'm going to add a new material, and in this I'm going to change the viewport color to yellow. And right now we have a material offset of -1. 0 or -1 in Blender often means no effect. If I put this to 0, that would mean it takes material slot number 0, which doesn't make any difference because the entire material has slot number 0. But watch what happens if I assign this material. You can see, since the bevel modifier is using material slot 0, which is the first, and the rest of the cube is using material number 1, the edges become blue. And of course, usually you would give your object this material and then choose the material slot number 1 for the bevel modifier, but this is just preference, personal preference. The clamp overlap is basically a safety feature. Let's just go nuts and overboard and disable this, and you can see that the faces are doing something we probably did not intend. So if you choose the clamp overlap, it will limit the deformation up to a point where those newly created faces would overlap. No, they don't. So if I turn this back down, you can see that it works as expected. This is just a safety precaution, so it doesn't create those weird overlapping faces. The limitation method right now is none. You won't see much of a difference between angle and none, because right now every edge we have has an angle of 90 degrees. This one, and so on. But if I add an edge loop in here, which has a 180 degrees, which is basically none, but it's important that it's above 90. And I set this to none, you can see there's a bevel being created in the middle of my mesh, which of course stems from the non-limitation method. But if I choose ankle, it'll only affect ankles that are greater than 30 degrees. And let's just create a couple of different ankles so we can see a lot better. And let's say we make this, I'll keep it like that. And now if I turn up the ankle, you can see at some point this will disappear, which is very nice because not every edge needs to be beveled, but the ones that are 90 degrees need to be beveled pretty much for sure. And you can see if I keep increasing the ankle, even the more sharp corners will disappear. Okay, so let's have a look at the weight limitation. If I limit this by the weight, you can see it completely disappears, and this is basically because no weights have been assigned. So how do you assign a weight? If I press N, I get this menu here, and if I go into edit mode by pressing tab, you can see that we have mean bevel weight for the vertices and mean bevel weight for the edges. Let's start with the vertices because I think that's explained a lot faster. You can see nothing happens. If I increase the bevel weight to 1 here, you can see that this 1 gets multiplied by the width. And let's set the segments back to 1. Okay, and now this one I'm going to set to 0.5. And you can see it's half as big as this one. So for each vertex individually, you can decide the bevel weight, and of course you can choose your entire mesh and then influence the bevel weight by using the slider. And you can see, actually I did not know that. This is an interesting effect. That's I don't know when to use it yet, but maybe I'll find some example later, or you can leave one in the comments. Okay, I'm going to turn off only vertices, and even though we have applied some bevel weight, everything disappears, and this is because we did not apply the bevel weight to the edges. I'm going to switch to Edge Select. Control Tab will do that for you, or you can click this little icon. Now if I choose this edge and I'm going to increase the bevel weight, you can immediately see, since the option is weight, there we have a bevel effect. I'm going to make this a little smaller, and again this bevel weight is multiplied by the width, so it's influencing not only where it is but also the amount. One thing that may look a little weird is if you have this, if you're out of edit mode, you can see this is one line following one edge, and if I use a different bevel weight for this than I do for this line, you might get some funky behavior at the edges here, so don't go overboard with that. And I usually don't use different bevel weights for adjacent edges. It's a difference if you use a different bevel weight for this one, say just a tiny bit, but that makes it even more weird. So I'm going to turn off this one, and this looks okay, I guess. But in general, continuous edges should only have one bevel weight. Something you might notice if you go back to Vertex Select mode, which is this one, you can see that the bevel weight option for the edges disappears. And this is because we don't have an edge selected. If we do select two of them, that's an edge, at least if they are connected by an edge. So I'm going to choose these two, and you can see the bevel weight option appears. If I turn this off, you can see that the vertex already has a bevel weight of 1 as opposed to the default bevel weight of the edge, which is 0. And of course, changing the bevel weight here doesn't do much of a difference because we're not beveling the vertices. One of the new functionalities of the bevel modifier is the ability to choose groups, vertex groups, which you can do with most modifiers. For this, let me just add a group. And I'm going to go back to Edge Select and just assign this edge to the weight group. And I'm going back to the modifiers and switch this to Edge Bevel again. And if you don't choose a group, Blender will automatically assume that you want all the vertices to be influenced. So I'm just going to choose our group, and you can see if I go to weight paint mode, Control Tab will do that for you. You will see that these two vertices are the only one affected by the assignment here, and this is where the beveling takes place. Now they have a weight of 1, which you can put in here, and in the beginning I thought, okay, limiting this to vertex groups would mean you can influence the or the bevel width as well, but that's not the case. There is a take it or leave it deal. There's a threshold which is 0.5. If I use an edge and put it to 0.49 and assign it, you can see that it will not be influenced. If I put it to 0.51, you can see it will get beveled. Now, why did this edge disappear as well if I choose the 0.49? The reason is this is not edge groups, it's vertex groups. So this vertex is in here, and as soon as any of the vertices of an edge is below the threshold of 0.5, it will be ignored by the bevel modifier. So 0.51, assign, and it's back again. If you want to influence the factor of which bevel edges are assigned or are influenced, you probably have to use the bevel weight, whereas the vertex groups can be handy if you already have one assigned for some other reasons. You could just use it for the bevel modifier as well. I'm going to go to the non method again because it better illustrates the width methods we can use here. The bevel modifier became much more sophisticated, and now I'm actually much less afraid to use it because, one, it does not destroy UVs anymore, And the other reason is we have very cool options to choose how and where to bevel the mesh. I'm not only talking about the limit methods, they're basically the same except the vertex groups, but the width methods. If you scroll over one, that explanation didn't tell me that much. Amount is offset of the new edge from original. Alright, let's have a look at what this means. For this, I'm going to create a new object. I'm just going to use a plane, and I'm going to move this up a bit, then extrude, move this to the left, like this, so we have a very sharp angle. And in edit mode, so it's the same object, because then we can influence the same object with the same modifier, I'm going to use this. Now let's just put them on top of each other, go back into perspective, and there, this should perfectly illustrate the point. Of course, I need a bevel modifier on this object. Here we go. In fact, let me push this down a bit further so we have an even less steep angle. And again, to illustrate this better, I'm going to choose my two materials and an offset of 1. So to illustrate what this means, I'm going to duplicate the object and apply the modifier. And on my original, I'll turn it off. If I go into wireframe mode now, you can see this is the one with the applied modifier, and this is the one with the modifier disabled. Now, offset means that with this method, the distance between the old edge and the place where the bevel starts is always this. So this is the method where to get the angle from. I'm going to use a plane here and scale this down. And here we go. So this is the distance that should be always the same with this method. I'm going to put the cursor to selected and rotate it 90 degrees, and you can see this still fits. Let's move this up here so we can compare that angle as well. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees, put it over here, set the cursor here, and again rotate around the cursor, and you can see it still fits. So even those beveled edges look fairly different. The method to determine how this edge is created is the actual distance between the old edge and where the new edge starts, or where the newly created face starts. Let's delete this object and re-enable the bevel modifier on this one. Let's have a look at the width option. The width is fairly self-explanatory. Each face that gets created by the bevel modifier, all the yellow ones here, will have the same width no matter what the angle of the adjacent edges was, which is very handy because sometimes you just need to make your bevel edges all look the same, or you can even use it to just paint stripes on your object. The next one is the depth. I think it has the most confusing description, so let me explain what this does. Again, I'm going to duplicate the object, apply the modifier, and here I'm going to disable the modifier. The result is even more drastic in its difference. You can see this is very small, very narrow, while these two faces got very, very large. So let's have a look at what's happening here. The description says it's the amount is perpendicular distance from original edge to bevel face. The original edge again is this, and the newly created face obviously is this. If I turn on normal display here, you can see there's a normal pointing from each face, and you can also see that the normal from this face points exactly towards the original edge that it derived from. And right now the normal size is 0.1, and coincidentally the width of our modifier is 0.1 and the scale is 111, so this perfectly fits. And it's the same here. So the distance of its center to the original edge is always the same, no matter what the angle is. Here we go. So again, I'm going to delete the object that I just created and re-enable the bevel modifier over here. Let's get to the last option, which is percent, and usually if you use percent you need to increase the width significantly. Let's read what it says first. The amount is percent of adjacent edge length. Those two edges have about the same length, so they're not very helpful in the illustration of this point, but once you get to this part you can see if I manipulate this, the edge gets smaller. The newly beveled face will get smaller. It's probably even more visible if I create a new face. That face unfortunately got material number 1. Okay, there we go. I flipped the normals earlier, so that became black. And now you can see this edge here is longer than this one. So the thickness of the bevel modifier is bigger if the adjacent edge that derives from it is longer. Does that make sense? I'm going to get the cursor over here so I can scale away from it, period. And you can see as I increase this edge here becomes thicker. Okay, so with the increasing of the length of this edge, the adjacent length gets a wider bevel. So there you have it. Blender developers managed to turn one of the most simple modifiers into one of those that needs the longest explanation, which I think is great because it shows the development of Blender, and also it comes with a lot of new and very, very handy options.